Today we're going to talk about the war in Iraq. And just like we did with the Unit on Foreign Policy, we're going to use the example of Iraq to illustrate some of the challenges the U.S. faces in terms of deciding what our defense strategy should be for the rest of the 21st century. So what this video is going to do is give you just some basic information about what happened in Iraq so that you can take that and work with it in class to understand more about defense policy. So at the end of today's video lecture, I'd like you to be able to answer several questions. Remember that there's also a very short video from the Council on Foreign Relations about the Sunni-Shia divide. So watch that before you take the quiz. So I want you to be able to explain how do Sunnis and Shias relate to the war in Iraq. What happened in the very early weeks of this war in Iraq? And how did the war change, especially right around the time President Bush declared that major combat operations were over in Iraq? How did the U.S. occupying authority deal with the Iraqi army? What was the surge? What was its goal, and did it succeed? And what about the Sunni awakening? What was the situation in Iraq as U.S. troops withdrew in 2011? And then how did all of what happened in Iraq from 2003 to 2011 lead into today's situation that we face in Iraq? So in 2003, the Bush administration made the decision to invade Iraq. And so you might be wondering, okay, how did all of this get started? President George W. Bush and his administration, in reaction to the events of 9/11, were concerned that Saddam Hussein might be developing the capacity to build a nuclear weapon or other weapons of mass destruction like chemical or biological weapons. There was some intelligence suggesting that this might be happening, and also Saddam Hussein was under UN sanctions that required him to allow UN inspectors to come in and prove that he wasn't developing a nuclear weapon. He was very uncooperative with these inspectors. So Bush decided to attack Iraq. And this was a very different battle from the first Iraq War. In the first Iraq War under the first President Bush in the early 1990s, the goal was simply to fight Iraq so that it would withdraw from the neighboring country of Kuwait, which it had invaded. But in 2003, President George W. Bush had a much bigger goal. His goal was what the Bush administration called regime change. That meant to actually defeat, not just push the Iraqi army back, but actually defeat the entire government of Iraq and replace it with a new government. And this mission was very quickly accomplished. The U.S. military forces were so overwhelming against the Iraqi army that within 3 weeks the U.S. had reached Baghdad, Saddam Hussein had fled into hiding, and we were able to actually take over government of Iraq. You can see here the statue of Saddam Hussein being pulled down by friendly Iraqis along with U.S. military forces. So, right around this same time, President Bush, in a very dramatic speech, he flew in on a fighter jet onto an aircraft carrier. He declared that major combat operations in Iraq were over. And even though we were beginning to see the development of lawlessness in Iraq, very quickly after the U.S. occupying forces arrived, we saw rioting, looting in Baghdad. Secretary of Defense Donald Donald Rumsfeld dismissed all of this as really nothing to worry about. The Bush administration was very optimistic that we were on the road to success, to a stable Iraq. And so, but we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to create a new government for Iraq? President Bush appointed Paul Bremer to be the new temporary civilian leader of Iraq for the occupying force. And Mr. Bremer made a decision early on that many people view as a mistake. His decision was to disband the Iraqi military and police forces. So this might seem like a very natural thing to do, because after all, we just fought a battle against these military forces. They were loyal to Saddam Hussein, and why would we want to keep them hanging around, pay their salaries? But if you think about it, what this decision meant was that thousands of people with military training were left unemployed. Many of them left with their weapons and were without very good prospects, with good reason to resent the United States. And so some people look back and see this as kind of the beginning of a deteriorating situation in Iraq. Violence began to grow very quickly at this point. Many people call this sectarian violence because it was violence between different ethnic groups in Iraq. So this is a little bit hard for us to understand from an American perspective, because after all, many Iraqis were glad to see Saddam Hussein go. There were cheering crowds when the US military first arrived. But you have to think about what an uncertain situation this was for the Iraqis, because they were unsure who might control the future of Iraq. Sunnis had been dominant under Saddam Hussein, but they are a minority of the population. So they were very afraid of the Shia majority and its dominance of the future of Iraq. This made for a very fertile situation for al-Qaeda to move in, including sending in fighters from outside Iraq to carry out strikes against Shia religious sites. And then we saw the development of an insurgency against US forces using IEDs, improvised explosive devices, suicide bombings, and a kind of urban guerrilla warfare in which the insurgents were hidden within the population, and it was very difficult for US soldiers to know who they're fighting against. This was a really different kind of battle from those first 3 weeks that went so quickly. So, despite this kind of spiraling violence, the US went ahead and working with various Iraqi groups, wrote a provisional constitution. Elections were held in 2005. The Sunni population largely boycotted this election to express their frustration with how things were going. And President Maliki, a Shia, was elected to govern Iraq. By 2007, the Bush administration was becoming concerned because what the Bush administration had thought would be a quick battle, Iraqis would quickly establish a functioning democratic government to replace Saddam Hussein, and the US would leave. Instead, it turned out that we were stuck in Iraq trying to put back together a country that seemed very difficult to stabilize. So by 2007, President Bush decided to replace his defense secretary. Donald Rumsfeld resigned and was replaced by Robert Gates. And he also replaced the military leadership in Iraq, bringing in General David Petraeus. these new leaders decided to try a new strategy, which they called the surge. They felt that the U.S. had never had enough troops on the ground to stabilize Iraq. And so by sending tens of thousands of additional troops with the goal of really fighting the insurgents and establishing control on the ground throughout Iraq, they hoped to stabilize the situation. And they were largely successful. Along with that, General David Petraeus carried out a policy that's sometimes called the Sunni Awakening. And in this effort, the U.S. military actually paid cash to Sunni tribal leaders who agreed to fight with the United States against al-Qaeda in Iraq. So this was an effort to end the insurgency and to actually get the Sunnis on the U.S. side. And again, this probably was somewhat successful. However, all of this additional fighting to stabilize Iraq meant we did see a spike in U.S. troop losses. And by 2010, when President Obama was elected, the American public was very tired of this very long battle in Iraq. And so President Obama was elected with the promise to withdraw all troops from Iraq. He was warned publicly and privately that Iraq might not be stable enough to continue in a peaceful situation or somewhat peaceful situation without U.S. troop presence. But by the end of 2011, President Obama withdrew almost all U.S. troops from Iraq. So, what happened after the U.S. withdrawal? Naturally, President Maliki was somewhat nervous about maintaining control and very fearful that he might lose power, that things could erupt back into a civil war. And so he actually moved to consolidate Shia power, purging Sunnis again out of the military and the government. Sunnis become even more fearful than they already were about their future in an Iraq dominated by Shia Muslims. And so this was very fertile ground for the development of ISIS, which is a Sunni Muslim movement to establish an Islamic State in Iraq, Syria, and beyond. So you can see here on this map from the BBC, in the spring of 2015, the spread of ISIS control throughout Iraq. This has been a very challenging situation for the Obama administration, which didn't want to be involved overseas in Iraq at all. But we see now the U.S. engaged in a bombing campaign against ISIS, sending some U.S. military advisors in to help the Iraqi army fight ISIS. And so it seems that the effort to withdraw troops may not have worked out. So, what are your next steps? At this point, I hope you can answer the questions at the beginning of the video. And you can go back and take a look at those before you take the online quiz if you want to. In class, what your team is going to do is meet together and think about how did the U.S. policy work in Iraq? What might we have done differently? And we'll provide you with some resources that you can access online. So if possible, please bring a laptop with you. Thanks, and I'll see you in class.